You were quoted in the Financial Times in May, 6-7 months ago, as saying the logistics are terrifying. I'm assuming you're firstly quoted accurately, and have things improved since May?
No, actually, considering there are almost 200 countries in the world, and we have signed some form of agreement with almost every one of them, and if one of them, let's do a little bit of math. If we have, I think the number in the Financial Times is correct, 750 agreements. It's just making 750 phone calls to 200 counterparts and saying, are we okay with this agreement? Is this something that we can just continue? That in itself is going to require quite a lot of manpower. And imagine then going to those places or having them come to London and actually negotiate them or even discuss them. I'm not really sure how that will be done logistically.
Sorry, Chair, you said it would take quite a lot of time. How much time do you think it would take?
It depends on the benevolence of the UK government and the counterparts.
The benevolence more of the counterparts than the UK government, really?
It depends on what kind of generosity they will show in terms of transition, in terms of just continuing the relationship. It's very, very difficult to assess until we actually sit down and actually talk about this agreement with the counterparts and what the future relationship is going to be. It's not only with the EU. This is the irony of the European Union, is that it's relatively easy to actually transition into the EU, and that in itself it's a process that could take decades, as we know, whereas while you are in, you undertake a number of commitments on the EU level, and which you may not even be aware about or you may take for granted. And once you leave, and all these have to be recreated, leaving is much more difficult than actually entering. And one aspect of the EU treaties is that many of them actually have something called the territorial principle, which means that they only apply to EU members. For example, EU FTAs contain such a paragraph saying that actually an FTA, even though it's actually signed by the UK as well as the European Union, it only the benefits of the agreement only is afforded to those who have signed the treaty or functioning of the European Union.
Before I move to my two colleagues on the right who are very keen to come in, just for clarification, of the 759, which do you think will be easily done? Which do you think a young negotiator might think, I can make a name for myself by getting an extra advantage for my country? Or are all these agreements got aspects of that in them?
Yeah. On a general basis, this is very difficult to draw a general case, but most multilateral agreements where more than 100 countries have signed on to one single text, they are relatively easy. And in some cases, I would even say that it's not even necessary for the UK to re-sign that agreement, because some of them actually contain two signatures, European Commission as well as the UK. So we are already covered. We don't have to actually, we are not exiting that agreement. In some cases, it changes our commitments, and this is very true in the case of the free trade agreements we have signed. And in those cases, there will be renegotiation, and there will be quite a lot of political entrepreneurship, I would guess, from both sides to actually try to change the terms of trade to their benefit. And I think most counterparts of the UK have recognized the fact that they would need to transition the agreement into a bilateral context, but in the end, it will come at a certain price. In other cases, for example, agriculture and fisheries, I mean, these are cases where managed trade prevail. You don't give up anything, and if you can actually change the terms of trade to your advantage, you're going to try to do so. And it's not just our counterparts, it might also be the European Union or another country, a third country, who might find it beneficial to try to exploit the situation. Energy is extremely sensitive area, and the UK leaving Euratom is actually, I think, one of the really big question marks in terms of how is UK going to actually find the material to continue its nuclear power plants. And the list is endless, and I can't really. It's very difficult to say that all the agreements that have been signed in the name of the UK and the member states for the last 30 years or so, amongst them, which are there any general direction on what are red, amber, or blue? I think it's very. It's rather dangerous for me to actually even try to make such a generalization.
Yeah, you say it's easier to enter than to leave the European Union. Tell that to Turkey, because they've been strung around for years on trying to comply with this chapter, that chapter, and the other chapter, and they're further away from joining now than they were at the beginning. So I don't see where you get that from. I think you're being incredibly pessimistic about the dialogue that takes place compared to, for instance, the Canadian deal that's taken 8 years to do. TTIP fell to pieces with the United States of America. That's gone absolutely nowhere. Britain, do you agree that Britain's now got a better chance of doing a trade deal with the United States of America than the European Union?
Let me try to answer the questions in sequence. Tell that to Turkey. Yes, I have. I've told that to Turkish government, and it is indeed rather. Yeah, it's the political situation between EU and Turkey is very interesting one, to say the least. And I do understand also that Turkey has taken certain political action. At some point you do realize that you are not welcome to a club. And the question is if the Groucho Marx principle applies, so to speak. But once you do enter into an accession, legally speaking, not politically, but legally, you do undertake the entire acquis, and including all the commitments that has been undertaken in the name of EU. And that is relatively simple logistically and legally to do, rather than to separate out commitments that has been made as a collective. That is, to use a very familiar analogy, it's very often easier to get married than getting divorced. And this is not a political statement about whether EU is an easy party to negotiate accession with.
As a single bloke, I'm not so sure about that.
We don't want a Greek session.
I will refrain from answering that question, but yes, my answer was purely legal and logistics of actually leaving versus entering. And I believe the second important question about the easiness of doing a trade agreement with the United States. I think most trade negotiators will agree that the United States is the most difficult country to negotiate with. It projects enormous amount of influence, standard setting power, and it also knows the attractiveness of its own domestic market, and therefore it gives very little in the negotiations. And at the same time, United States is perfectly aware. It's one of the best informed business groups and the trade negotiating entities in the world, which means that they know exactly what they want, and they have scoped them out for years ahead. And they are going to ask for a number of things on the table before you even start negotiations. Frankly speaking, the endeavor that was TTIP, could have never been an easy one, because EU is very much the same way. It is the biggest single market, internal market in the world. It projects enormous amount of standard setting influence, if not more than the United States nowadays. And if you put two entities who are not accustomed to make compromises, they are not going to, it's going to be very difficult to negotiate something that goes beyond existing FTAs. In addition, I think one of the mistakes that took place in the TTIP negotiation is the fact that we as in the European Union have very few mutual recognition agreements or very few regulatory cooperation that exist in the FTA field with the United States. that meant actually that we are starting from a very low level. And in essence, we had two entities who couldn't compromise, who are not used to compromise at least, and starting from a very low level and try to deliver what they call an FTA++, going beyond the recent FTAs, and that is going to be extremely difficult. And in the sense of UK, in negotiating with in negotiating with the United States, I would have to add that 2 points. One is the requests that the United States want is still on the table, and what UK wants is essentially some of the most sensitive issues for the United States to negotiate in an agreement. It has never put financial services up for negotiation, for example. It put very few, almost no services sector up for negotiation in its FTAs. And that's where UK's primary interests lie. UK tried and succeeded to leverage on the other member state in presenting the offensive interest of the UK via EU as a common EU interest, with all the compromises that the EU could offer, and still couldn't get them from the United States. I am not really clear how UK would succeed better than EU.
Yeah, without being overly pessimistic, of course, it's possible to sign those trade agreements once the UK is no longer a member of the European Union. But one has to also see that Switzerland, for example, also tried to negotiate with the United States and also failed. So the EU is not alone in failing. So unless you are really willing to give in to US demands, it's just very difficult to conclude those agreements. And just very quickly on because you also asked for some kind of assessment of the time that this may take. So in our database, we find that on average for any country in the world, it takes about 2 years to sign a trade agreement. And many of those trade agreements are not particularly deep, so there's a lot of variation. But also lots of countries other than the European Union, it takes them a long time to agree on those trade agreements because they are just very complex. So they often go into 1,000 pages, and it just takes time to agree on such a long legal text.